Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 21 Part 4. In this part of the build log, I'm going to build the water cooling loop and fill it, work more on the custom wiring, and bring the system close to completion. I'm going to start this video by attempting to answer the very complex question of how do I choose fittings for my build. And this is something that I haven't really seen anybody talking about because it's nearly an impossible question to answer. I mean, I've helped many individuals with this over the years, and it's easy to, help one person for one build, but answering this question for everybody and every build is very difficult. To answer this properly, I need to go back to the beginning. In the days of soft tube, we didn't even need to think about fittings because we were just using 2 compression fittings per component, and the soft tube would do the rest. So there's no doubt it was the introduction of hard tube that made fittings a lot more complex. And I was certainly one of the first people to start using hard tube and to introduce it. And the reason I started using it was because it was my first X79 build, and there was an extra water block on the motherboard area, an extra memory water block. Instead of there being 1 memory bank, there was 2, and so there were 5 water blocks in extremely close vicinity, and it was the first time where I didn't have enough space to tube up with soft tube, and so I had to find a solution and do something else. Now, I'd wanted to use hard tube for many years, but the thing was there was only 1 fitting available for it from Bits Power in the 12mm OD size, so the smallest tubing size. And back in those days, people had a real thing about flow, and if anybody saw a loop with a smaller tube size or a smaller fitting or something, they would absolutely hate it. And that was amazingly the response that I got when I built the first system I'd ever built with hard tube. And I only used it on the motherboard area between the water blocks, not even for the entire loop. And there was a lot of negativity, a lot of people saying that's going to restrict your flow. And I started to question myself and think, well, maybe I won't do this again. But next thing, I started seeing it everywhere in everybody's builds, and hard tube just took off in no time. But something that was kind of holding it back was the complexity of the fittings. It was a very steep learning curve for a lot of people. And I started to get hundreds of people asking me to help them with the fittings for their builds. And the thing is, obviously, every build is going to be different and have different fittings. There are so many fittings to choose from. I mean, Bits Power alone has over 700 fittings in their range. If you change one small thing, you change your component order or tubing routing, it completely changes the fittings. It's the part of your loop with the most components, the most variables, and fittings are also expensive. And it just makes it very daunting to choose fittings. They add up very quickly. And I'd say that the tubing up, building your loop, is the part of a water-cooled system that takes the most expertise, thought, and design, and fittings play a huge role in that, so they are incredibly important. But in my opinion, it's the thinking surrounding fittings that became more complex with hard tube, not necessarily the fitting. I mean, they did it first, but things have changed now. So certainly at first, it made things more complex because in the early days of hard tube, there were only short lengths of acrylic available. And so the first hard tube loops, we had to join short lengths of acrylic tube. We weren't yet bending tube. And so fittings for the bends and just lots and lots of fittings. And so people soon got the idea that to build a hardline loop, you need a huge amount of fittings and it's extremely expensive. But things have changed. I mean, the major thing that has really changed this is the introduction of acrylic tube bending. So that means a lot less fittings. But also all of the new fittings that we now have, the development of our technique, learning more about hard tube has meant that it's not as complex as it used to be. And in my opinion, the best way to answer this question is that we need to go back to the thinking that we had with soft tube. And we need to start with the basics, the bare essentials, which is 2 hardline compression fittings per component. And I know a lot of people's answer to this is going to be, you need to have your entire system planned out to know exactly what fittings you are going to need, which theoretically is true. But if you try to put that into practice, Unless you've built that system before with that exact case and those components, it's just not possible. There are too many unknowns and variables to take into consideration. All of those measurements and angles, there is no way that you're going to be able to figure all of that out. And what's going to happen is when it comes time to build the loop, you're either going to have not enough fittings, too many, or the wrong fittings, or if you do happen to fluke it and get it right, you're going to find other better ways of optimizing that loop design, and you're not going to be able to do it because of your preconceived design and the fittings that you already have. And so that is not really the answer. What you need to do is give yourself as much freedom as possible to build the loop however you want to when it comes time to build it. And I never design my loops until I'm actually building them. Sometimes you have to think a little bit of it out in advance, or I mean, if you're doing a major mod, sometimes a lot of it, but most of the time in a build like this, for example, I didn't even think about the loop until it came time to actually build it. And I let the components and the case tell me how to build the loop. And I also have 2 rules or guidelines that I came up with many years ago that I stick to, which I'm going to cover in the next part of the build log. So giving yourself as much freedom as possible, what does that mean? You start with the basics, the bare essentials, 2 hardline compression fittings per component. And obviously some of the components are going to be joined, and so that means even less fittings. Now, every 90-degree single rotary fitting that you add is going to mean 1 less bend in the acrylic tube. And something else that I should mention is that you can build a hardline loop just with the bare essentials, but I have found that there is a limit to bending hard tube, particularly acrylic tube, that doesn't come down to skill or the time and effort that you put into it. It's a limit in the material and the technique used to bend it. For example, if you are doing your second bend and you're heating the tube and you end up heating your first bend and the first bend falls out of shape, well, that length of tube is then pretty much ruined and you need to start again. And I see so many builds, almost every hardline build where people have done acrylic tube bending, where all of the angles are off, there's squashes and kinks and lines in the tube, there's pressure on the components, and that is not so much from inexperience. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's often because people have just pushed the limits a bit too far with bending the tube. And so we need to find a balance between doing all of the bends in the tube and going all out with the fittings and using fittings for the bends, you know, like we used to when we first started building hardline loops. Adding a 90-degree single rotary means 1 less bend. So imagine this, if you add half the amount of 90-degree single rotaries that you have of hardline compression fittings, that means 1 less bend in each length of tube. If you add the same number, it means 2 less bends in each length of tube. I mean, to a certain extent. So that's the type of thinking you need to have. Then you need to add just a few, usually 2, maybe in a massive build, 4 90-degree dual rotary fittings, because they are the most versatile water cooling fitting and they're going to get you out of any tight spots or difficult spots that you get into with your loop, because they can be a 45, a 90, or anything in between, any angle 360 degrees. Other than that, it's just extension fittings. And the more water blocks you have, the more extension fittings you are going to need. That is generally where they are going to be used. Something that I became very well known for was my tubing configurations between the water blocks on the motherboard area. And, you know, I used to set up, and I still do, these configs where all of the tube is level and, you know, it's all confined to a very tight area, clean and, you know, symmetrical. And if you're going to build something like that, you need to have a lot of extension fittings. So the sizes, the little 5mm extension, 15, 20, 25, 30, and only occasionally will I use 40 and 50, only if I have, you know, 6, 7, or 8 water blocks in a massive system. But for a build like this, and generally I'm only going to use the 5mm, 15, 20, 25, and 30. 2 of each is more than enough for a build of this size, just to give you an idea. But if you think it out, it's not that difficult because you only really need them on the motherboard area, and you might need a couple for getting out of tight spots on the inlets and outlets of radiators. Other than that, you're only going to need the drainage system which is simple. It's just a valve and a male to male fitting, because the valve has a female thread and what you're going to be connecting it to generally has a female thread. And the best place to connect it is just to any free port. On a pump top, there's usually a free port. You know, you don't need to do the complex drainage systems that you see me doing. They do take a lot of fittings. I'll talk about why I actually do it this way later in the build log. And other than that, just, you know, if you have multiple graphics cards, think about how you're going to tube up between them. There's a lot of different options. And that's about it. So it's not about planning out your entire loop, your entire system beforehand. It's about giving yourself as much freedom as possible. And that doesn't mean ordering heaps of fittings. It just means putting a bit of thought into it and choosing fittings that are versatile. I've completed and filled the loop, and you can see a little head there in the way. That's my youngest 2-year-old son. He always has to be there for this part of my builds, and I couldn't get him to get his head out of the way of the camera. He absolutely loves this part of the build. And I know a lot of you do too. Everyone always says that filling the loop is the best part of a water-cooled build, and I must say I definitely agree. So I'm adding some Mayhem's dark blue dye to the Mayhem's X1 UV green coolant because I want a far deeper, more vibrant green than this very yellowy acidic green. You know, I want more of a Nvidia or Razor green for this build. And only a few drops of the blue, because it's very potent and powerful, was more than enough to create the exact color that I wanted, and I'm very happy with the color I've ended up with. Actually, I may end up adding a little bit more blue to it to darken it up a little bit more. And I have always had a large collection of Mayhem's dyes. I mean, Mayhem's products have been around for years, mainly their dyes, and it's great to have the freedom to create any color that you want to. You know, you can start with clear, or if it's pastel, white coolant, and create your colors from the ground up, or you can add to, you know, existing colors. I never use the stock colors. I always create colors of my own, you know, whether it's adding to one of the stock colors or creating it from the ground up. You might have noticed that I had a problem with the pump when I first started to fill the loop. It was running very slowly, and it turns out this is an inherent problem with a lot of the new D5 PWM pumps. As far as I know, it's just EK, but I know a lot of these pumps are rebrands, so it could be all of them. And I'm sure that some of you have already run into this problem where if the pump's not receiving a PWM signal, which of course it's not going to be when you're filling your loop unless you're running your entire system, which you definitely shouldn't be, the pump only runs at probably less than 5% of its RPM, and you can't even fill the loop because it's running too slow to actually circulate the coolant properly. You know, you really need your pump running at 100% to fill your loop. Whereas the old PWM pumps, if they didn't get a PWM signal, they'd just run at 100%, which is the way it should be. Well, it turns out there is a quick and easy way around this, which is just a bit of custom cabling. So you can see the custom cable that I've built here. I'm going to take you through exactly how to do this in the next part of the build log. What you're looking at here are some incredible custom cables for the core components in this build, built by IceMods. And when I mentioned that I've been working with IceMods to create some of my custom cables in a recent video, a few people were surprised and commented on it and said, you know, why would I be working with somebody else to create custom cables when I can create my own? Well, I've been creating my own for years, and the thing is, for something that I'm passionate about, and I do it because I love it, I am not competitive about it. I don't believe in competition for this, for something that I love doing. And so I am more than happy to work with absolutely anybody who shares my passion and who is good at what they do. And that definitely sums up IceMods. And, you know, instead of putting my energy into trying to stamp out everybody else, that just creates stagnation and monopolies. I would much rather put my energy into putting our heads together, working together, because the goal here is not to beat everybody else. It's to bring new and exciting ideas and technology to this industry, and who knows what can come out of that. And that is exactly what I'm doing. There are so many products that I'm working on that will completely change this industry. I just hope they'll see the light of day, because it's very difficult to release even one product. And this brings me to the SingularityComputers store. Now, since the opening of the store only a short time ago, it has been rapidly expanding. We are constantly adding new products to the store, so make sure that you continue to check it out, because it's probably the most rapidly expanded store I've ever seen. It's very exciting, and we now have a full range of custom wiring supplies. We have wire, pins, connectors, sleeving, heat shrink, and tools, and we are about to add a whole range of different cable combs. And the products that we have on our store, what I'm doing with the store is I've been building systems for many years, and over that time I've become very fussy about the products and the brands that I use, and that is why I tend to every little detail in my builds, and I replace everything down to the pins, the wire, the connectors, because I like to use the products that I prefer, because from my personal experience and testing have come out on top. And so right down to the pins that we have, I mean, these are the gold plated pins that I use in my builds, that I love using, because not only are they gold plated for better conductivity, but I find that these pins don't deform as easily as the silver ones. The connectors that we have, sharp edges, harder plastic, no loose bits of plastic. These are the connectors you'll find on high-end power supplies. The wire that we have is a perfect balance between the insulation being too soft and the insulation being too hard. Very important to get a perfect crimp, and for cables that will actually train. We also have MDPCX products. We have sleeving, heat shrink, and tools, and you can see the pin remover here. Amazing stainless steel tool. You'll never buy another pin remover. Trust me, I've had this one for a long time. I absolutely love it. Our reservoir mounts will also be back in stock soon on the Singularity Computer store in all of the different colors. Also a new color and 2 new designs that we're adding to the range, which is very exciting. So I better leave this part of the build log here. That sums up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons. Thanks for watching.